Professor Amanda Clayton is assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley. She has consulted for such groups as the World Bank, USAID, and the OECD. Her work focuses on the causes and consequences of women's political representation. We're excited to hear her presentation today on gender quotas and the consequence of women's political representation. Please join me in welcoming Professor Clayton.
Hi, thank you so much for the really lovely and warm introduction and welcome. I'm really happy to be here. As per the introduction today, I'm going to be talking about gender quotas and the consequences of women's political representation. I'm going to focus some on my work, you'll see this here, but also on other folks that have done this over the last several years. And I like to start with this image. It's from a few years ago now, but it's all of the heads of state at a UN conference. And what I really like is this woman in red here, and just how much she stands out in the sea of black suits. And so that's sort of an image that I want you to keep in your mind, thinking about how rare women are, particularly in this position, at the top leadership position. But what I'm going to show you today is that this is actually changing, particularly in politics. Okay, let me just start with some facts. I'm first going to talk a little bit about women in the executive position, so presidents or prime ministers in their countries, and then talk a little bit about women's political representation in national legislatures. So since 1960, only 54 women ever have become the top of their country, so presidents in presidential systems, prime ministers in parliamentary systems. And I don't know what the number is for men. In fact, I don't know if anyone knows what that number is, right? It's in the thousands, if not tens of thousands. So this is a very small number. And I think what's really important too to know is even this 54 number might be sort of overestimating what this number actually is, because before 1995, 42% of these women actually had famous husbands or fathers who preceded them in political life. So they followed often what was called the widow's route to power, right? So Isabel Perón in Argentina being sort of a classic example of that, but you can also think of Indira Gandhi in India, Corazon Aquino in the Philippines, or Benazir Bhutto in Pakistan. So women that came from political dynasties. And there's a lot of variation by region, even still. So today, for instance, in Asia, still every woman who has ever held top political office in her country had a husband, father, or brother who preceded her. So again, this was the most common way throughout the 20th century for women to attain political power. And it's changing slowly. What I think is also interesting to think about this phenomenon is that the West is not necessarily leading the way, as some of the names that I just mentioned might indicate. So until 1979, when Margaret Thatcher became the Prime Minister of Britain, all women to achieve this position were actually from the global South. And this is something that's going to be a theme throughout this talk, is I think there's this preconceived idea that the West, or maybe the US in particular, is advanced on these metrics, or maybe some countries that you would think of as good for gender equality are advanced on these metrics, but actually that's not universally the case. So currently, of the 54 women who have achieved these positions, most are from the global South. And I want to think about the types of ways that women achieve this particular type of office. So often you see women achieve top political office during periods of political transition or after unpopular leaders. We were just talking about Chile. Michelle Bachelet in Chile is an example of that, achieving presidency there after a period of political transition. It's also really common, and I think this is fascinating, in countries that are post-conflict. So when countries are moving from times of war to times of peace, this is when you also often see women take political leadership in their country. So Ellen Johnson Sirleaf of Liberia is a really sort of canonical example of this, the first woman elected to a presidency of an African country. You also often see them as interim presidents, so in times of political transitions, when there's sort of military conflicts that are ongoing, they maybe will hold office quickly. So for instance, Haiti has had a woman president, the Central African Republic, Bolivia, but this is often very short stints, sort of in between coup periods, for instance. And what I think is interesting and important here is that actually only 9 women ever have been elected to the presidency through popular votes, right? So women, or the electorate actually voting for a woman president. So this is very, very low, 9 ever. And again, if we were to count the number of men, it would be in the thousands. So this is still very, relatively rare. All right, so that was a little bit of an overview, a lay of the land of women in the executive. Now we can think about women in the legislative branch. So this is a map of women's parliamentary representation around the world. And I find when I teach this, I often have to define what parliament is. So parliament is the national legislature. It's the general term for the national legislature. So the US Congress would be our parliament, even though we don't call it parliament, right? So in the equivalent of the national legislature in every country around the world, this is the percentage of women. And this is what I think is what I want to emphasize about how the West not necessarily leading the way, right? So we see that Bolivia, for instance, has a majority female parliament. Iceland, you might expect Iceland there, and some of the countries that we would think of in Scandinavia, but also we see Mexico and Argentina and countries in Southern Africa as having really high representation too. And as I'm sort of presenting you this, and I'm not going to get into these sort of theories here. I would advise you to take a gender and politics class in order to think about these concepts. But as I'm talking about this, I sort of would invite you to think about why is this important? This concept that we call descriptive representation, which is just the numeric similarity between the legislative bodies and the electorate that they represent in terms of gender, race, and ethnicity, or other demographic characteristics. Right? So here we're thinking about gender, but you might apply it to other groups as well. And so this is just measuring whether or not people are actually present. And just thought experiment. Think for yourself, why is this important? And let me give you an image that might sort of help you think about this. This was done by Elle magazine a few years ago. This is a picture of the British House of Commons, so the lower house of the British Parliament. This is what it looks like. And then someone took the liberty of photoshopping out all of the men. And this is what it looks like just with the women. And again, I don't know, at least for me, I would come into this having a sense that this is probably not great for democracy or for other reasons that we might anticipate. And I would just invite you to think about, why that might be. Okay. Bear with me. I'm sorry. I'm getting over a bit of a head cold here. So I want us to think about where the U.S. lies in comparative perspective. So women comprise 29.2% of House seats and 25% of Senate seats. So that means there's 125 women in the House, 92 Democrat, 34 Republican. In the Senate, there are 25 women, 15 Democrat, 9 Republican, 1 independent. This puts the U.S. in terms of its global ranking. I'll show you a table in a second. But on par with Iraq. We are tied with number 71 place out of about 200 with Iraq. So this is what that looks like. So for instance, these are some countries that are performing better than us if you want to think of equality as better. So countries like Sierra Leone, Lithuania, Singapore, Iraq are performing the same as or better than us. And we're slightly above Colombia, Zimbabwe, Mali. So here's the U.S. Okay. And now what I want to talk about is thinking about why a lot of these countries around the world have achieved the success that they have. And part of the reason that they have achieved this success are through policies called electoral gender quotas. So quotas are policies required by federal law or adopted voluntarily by political parties, which require that women comprise a certain number of seats in or candidates for elected office. Okay, so there's sort of two parts of this, which is either the quota is set for the number of candidates, or there's actually seats that are set aside in the legislature itself for women. And they can either be required by law, or they can be voluntarily adopted by political parties. And I want to talk a little bit about where quotas come from and how popular they've become over the last, 40 years or so. So prior to the 1970s, only 5 countries in the world had any sort of quota, and today most countries have them. So 130 countries, in fact slightly more than this, have some sort of quota, either voluntary or in federal law, that they use for their national elections. Okay, and both in places that you might expect, places like Sweden, New Zealand, but also in surprising places. So places like Iraq, Sudan, Saudi Arabia, they also all have gender quotas. And part of my research agenda has been trying to understand, documenting this wide diffusion of quota policies and trying to understand why countries might adopt them. So here's a map of quota policies around the world. I'll let you look at that for a second while I take a sip of water. So you can see that there are 3 different types of quotas, and I'm going to talk about what each of these types are in a minute. So reserved seats, legislative candidate quotas, and voluntary political party quotas. And again, you see that they exist basically in every world region and in most countries around the world. So let me tell you sort of the mechanics of how quotas tend to work. All right, these are the 3 different types. Reserved seats reserve a number of seats in a legislative assembly for women, so just as the name would imply, right? So how does this work in practice? They usually designate separate districts only for women candidates, so women are only allowed to run in certain districts, or a designated percentage of seats held for women assigned by their proportion of the popular vote. So countries that have this, Saudi Arabia has this, for instance, Uganda has this, and India also in local elections, which is something that I'm going to return to in a minute. They tend to be adopted in electoral systems like the type that we have in the US, so majoritarian electoral systems where it's what we're familiar with, whoever gets the most votes win, and there's just one candidate who wins in each election. So what does this look like in practice? This is a picture, for instance, from Uganda. And you see here that these women are running as women MPs. So this one woman is running as a woman councillor, so in local elections. This woman is running for parliament or parliamentary elections. So they are running as women. And that's because they're running in an electoral map that looks like this. So this is Uganda. These districts with the dark lines are the districts that elect women representatives. And then there's sort of like these smaller sort of sub-districts, and those are open to like men and women. Anyone can compete, but only women can compete in these larger sort of super districts, right, that overlap on top of them. And through that, they're able to achieve at least 30% representation of women. I'm so sorry about my voice it's giving out, but bear with me. Okay, so that's how reserved seats tend to work. And then the next type, and this is actually probably the most popular type around the world, are called legislative candidate quotas. And this set aside places on electoral lists for female candidates. Countries that have this, pretty much all throughout Latin America, so Argentina, Mexico being really classic examples. And these are mostly in what are called proportional representation systems. So if you've taken a poli-sci class or a comparative politics class, you probably know what this means. It's different from how we elect representatives here in the US. So rather than voting for an individual candidate, you vote for a party. And then districts, rather than just being represented by one person, so your congressperson from this district, for instance, there are larger districts that are represented by multiple people. So one district might be represented by 10 people, and parties have a list of 10 candidates that could potentially represent that district. And here then, they're required to make sure that on that list, it's gender balanced. So in my example, there would be 5 women and 5 men, okay? It's a little bit, I could explain it more in the weeds, but this is actually the most common type of electoral system around the world, okay? And then finally, the last type of quota is a voluntary political party quota, and these are rules or targets set by political parties to include a certain percentage of women as candidates. So these are usually in their party constitution, so they're quite binding. Like they're not just like, oh, we think it would be a good idea to have women. They're actually sort of required by their own internal rules to have at least 50% women. South Africa has this, for instance, Sweden, major parties in these 2 countries. These are also often usually in what are in proportional representation systems. So it's similar to what I just described above, but rather than being required by federal law, the political parties say we voluntarily are going to make sure that any list of candidates that we put forward for a national election is going to be gender balanced. So I wanted to tell this to you because I think it's important to get into the weeds a little bit to understand how these quotas actually work with different electoral systems. If you're sort of like a electoral system nerd, as us comparative politics people tend to be. Okay, so I've told you that these quota policies have diffused really rapidly over the last, 20, 30, 40 years. Really, in particular, the first 20 years of the 21st century saw the most sort of rapid diffusion of quota policies. And now I want to spend a few minutes thinking about why we've seen this rapid proliferation and what explains this diffusion. Okay, so why are quotas adopted? There's a couple of different reasons that scholars have identified in the literature, just looking at cases. So there's not sort of one common reason across all countries. Countries will adopt quotas for different reasons, but they can sort of be grouped into 4 different categories, and so I'm going to focus on these categories. All right, the first one is what you might have think of when you're thinking about like why any sort of policy might pass. And this is because women mobilize for quotas to increase women's political representation. So that is, there are large groups in civil society, women's groups in civil society that say, you know, we've noticed that parliament is all men. We think that women deserve a spot to be there. We think that quotas are a way to achieve this. So women's groups in civil society really pressure and advocate to have quotas adopted at the national level. So that's one reason. Another reason, and you know, these might happen simultaneously, they're not mutually exclusive. But another reason is that political elites recognize the strategic advantages for supporting quotas. So quota adoption is more likely in countries that have competitive multi-party elections. So Mexico is a really sort of canonical case here. They were first adopted voluntarily by left-wing parties in order to attract women voters, to sort of say like, look, we're doing something for women's inclusion. And then the center party was sort of like, oh, look, we should do that too. They're making us look bad, so they did it. And then the right-wing party was like, oh, now everyone's doing it, and so we look really bad, so we'll adopt a voluntary quota. And this like back and forth went for really like decades, sort of starting in the 90s through the early 2000s, to where now there are statutory, so required 50% quotas for all political parties, and in every branch of government too. And it's been so successful in increasing women's political representation. Mexico has a near parity parliament and will elect a woman president in the next electoral cycle, in large part because like there's been so much effort in grooming women politicians in the country over the last several decades. So Mexico is sort of a classic story of really sort of both of these two factors interplaying. There's another sort of perhaps more cynical reason of like a strategic advantage that you might think of, and there's been a lot of work in political science on this at the moment, which is that that political elites realize that having a gender-balanced legislature looks really good to the international community. So Rwanda is sort of a canonical case here. It's an authoritarian regime that has the most women in parliament of any country in the world. So 60% of the Rwandan parliament is women. It's been ranked number 1 now for pretty much the last decade or so. But it's not a democracy. So you might think of this as a strategic choice that the president is using to sort of say to the international community, hey, we're performing really well on this measure, but maybe then trying to like hide sort of misdeeds like on other measures. So this is sort of like a more cynical interpretation. This can happen, but it's not the case everywhere. For instance, the case of Mexico, that wouldn't apply. Another sort of common reason that quotas emerge is because they're consistent with emerging notions of equality and representation. So countries are often likely to adopt quotas in times of democratic transition. I think South Africa is a really emblematic case here. So the ANC party, which is the Liberation Political Party of South Africa, Nelson Mandela's party, when they moved from apartheid to multiracial rule, the ANC said, look, we're beginning to think about what representation means, and that means representation of all people across all different races and ethnicities, but that also has to mean across both genders then too. So they adopted a gender quota at this time, really thinking about trying to open up what it means to be a representative democracy. Okay, and then finally, what you sort of see in looking at the diffusion of quotas is that they're supported by international norms and spread through transnational sharing. So groups like the EU, for instance, and the African Union, other sort of regional groups, explicitly promote the use of quotas. They say, we think quotas are a good idea, and they help achieve gender equality. And so because of this, we see that countries often will adopt quotas that are in the same regional bodies and around the same time. So sort of like a classic international relations story of countries looking to their peer countries and adopting similar policies. So we see that. And then finally, sorry, I think there's more than 4. This is the last one. There's been a few cases where quotas are imposed in post-conflict situations. So Afghanistan previously, not anymore, and Iraq as well are cases of this, where after the conflict, after the U.S. invasions in both cases, when they were writing new constitutions, they were sort of advised by the international community to include gender quotas in their new constitutions. So these are all, different reasons why countries might adopt quotas. I think they're all sort of fascinating in their own right. But the point I want to make here is that they have really dramatically transformed women's representation around the world, and particularly in the last quarter century. So this is what the sort of top countries looked like in the year 2000 in terms of women's political representation. So probably around the year you all were born. And if I were to ask you in the year 2000, or a group like you in the year 2000, who do you think the world leaders are? I probably would have heard people say Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Norway, right? The sort of like who you would expect. These countries perform really well on gender equality across a number of dimensions. And that's what we saw then. And if we fast forward 20 years, and I'm doing this intentionally because this is sort of the peak period of quota adoption, this is what it looked like by 2020. So I'll have you sort of look at those comparisons. And there's a few points that I want to make here. One is that the number 10 country here, South Africa, at 46.3%, is actually well above what the number 1 country was in 2000, right? So we just see a general increase sort of across the board. And these numbers, so they go from 61% to 46%, whereas the number 10 country in 2000 was already at 28%, right? So just all of these countries are sort of being like buoyed. And then we see just a lot more diversity. So countries like Rwanda, Bolivia, Mexico, for instance, are in the mix when they weren't necessarily at the turn of the century. All right, and part of the reason why we've seen this dramatic increase is that not only are quotas being adopted at a record pace, but their thresholds are also increasing. So in the early years of quota adoption, maybe political parties would say, okay, we're going to make sure that 10% of our candidates are women, or 20%. And that has sort of increased over time, where now the most sort of commonly adopted quota threshold is either there's still a lot at 30, but there's also increasingly parity quotas now. So more and more countries are saying, actually, it doesn't really make sense to say that women should be 30%. Like if we say that we're committed to equality, then it has to be parity, right? So we're seeing these thresholds increase over time. All right, and just another graph that I'll show you here. What does this mean for the average country that adopts a quota? So what I'm showing you here is for all countries that have adopted quotas, sort of centered on the year of quota adoption. So these are the year previous, these are the years after, following. And we see that countries, and this is women's parliamentary representation, we see that there is sort of an increase before quota adoption, but then a big jump, right? So on average, women's parliamentary representation doubles when countries adopt a quota from 10% to 20% in the first election cycle. All right, so I want to use the remaining time that I have to talk about what does this mean for policy. And this is something that I actually came to grad school being really interested in. Like, this dramatic change is happening around the world, and what does this mean then for representative democracy? What does it mean for public policy? And this is something that I've studied now extensively in the years since. And so I've read, pretty much every study that I could find that looks at this question, and I can say with confidence that overwhelmingly, quotas are followed by more legislative attention to issue areas that women voters tend to prefer. Okay, and what this means, if we look at survey data where we see gender gaps in political preferences, this means that there's more attention to poverty reduction. This is something that women tend to prefer on surveys. This is all empirical, right? Public health, again, something that women say that they tend to prioritize. Women's rights issues, and in the Global South, access to drinking water. And I can talk about why that's a women's issue in the Global South in a minute. So these issue areas is where we've really seen over and over again that when we see women's representation increase, particularly through the use of quotas, there's more legislative attention to these issues. So let me then, I'm always sort of, when I'm preparing lectures on this, there's so much evidence that it's hard to not overwhelm people. And so I'm gonna take us through a few different cases here. I might skip through some of them if I see your eyes glazing over, but the point that I just want to make is that this is a really, really consistent finding. So the cases that we're going to travel to kind of quickly are maternal health in Uganda, childcare policies across advanced democracies, new women's rights laws in Argentina, public health spending globally, and local investments in drinking water in India. Okay. So let me start with maternal mortality in Uganda. And this is actually not an empirical study. This is just an anecdote, but sometimes I feel like it's based off of a true story, like a true thing that happened. But sometimes I feel like these anecdotes or these examples can be like particularly powerful. So this happened in Uganda in 2013. All of the women parliamentarians had formed a group there called UWOPA, the Ugandan Parliamentary Women's Association. So it was all of the women. By the way, when I say MPs, that means member of parliament, so like legislators, all of the women legislators. And they had gotten together and they decided that they really needed to have a meeting with the president of the country. His name is Museveni, last name Museveni. And the reason why they wanted to have this meeting was because one of their staffers, a woman who was the coordinator for the Ugandan Parliamentary Forum for Children, she was in her mid-30s and she had died giving childbirth. And so they were aware of this, that this staffer, this person that they worked closely, had died in childbirth, and they were outraged, and they thought that this is really a travesty, and we demand increased national public funding for maternal health. So they met with the president, and they said, this is what our demands are. And what I think is really remarkable about this story is that then they actually, and at first the president was like, yeah, okay, but he wasn't really moving. And they refused to legislate, so they refused to show up for their jobs and pass a national budget until he said, yes, we're going to dedicate more of the Ugandan budget to maternal health. So they won, and like more funding was dedicated to maternal health. And I think this is just a really powerful example of what this can look like in practice, because I'm going to show you a lot of like correlations, examples, but this is sort of what's sort of behind these statistics. Okay. All right, so one country, this is from 19 democracies between 1970 and 2000, and the author here is looking at the relationship between women's political representation and policy outcomes across a range of outcomes. And what she found was that across these democracies over this time period, increases in women's representation in parliament significantly increased the adoption and scope of maternity and child care leave policies. So this is something that we see sort of really consistently. There was a new book that came out last year by a colleague that I have in the UK that found something very similar, that sort of progressive parental leave and really sort of long parental leave, this is something that women politicians advocate for and are often successful for when they enter into parliaments. This is a picture that I just wanted to include. It went viral a few years ago. It was the defense ministers of Norway, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Germany, all like sitting together at some like EU meeting. And this is the defense ministers of these countries. So what we would think of as sort of a very like masculine profile, but these are sort of the women that fill these roles in these countries. Okay. And then traveling now to Latin America, the case of Argentina, which I think I might have mentioned has passed a parity quota, so they're a 50% legislature. This is what the legislature looks like. And, you know, again, it's just sort of a thought experiment to think of like, you know, what if we woke up tomorrow and the US Congress was 50% women? You know, like these countries really do go through dramatic shifts. And this is what it looks like here, and this is what a gender balanced body looks like. And this is from a classic study looking at the effects of gender quotas. And what this graph shows you is Argentina adopted its first quotas already in 1991. They were the first country to adopt a candidate quota in the world. And they adopted it in their lower house, so like the equivalent of the House of Representatives in 91. And this is women's representation in the lower house. It climbs gradually over the years. But then they didn't adopt it in a quota in the Senate until the year 2000. And then when they adopted it, women's representation in the Senate increased dramatically, so from under 10% to close to 40%. And then this line is the number of women's rights bills that are introduced in the Congress. And we see that it only really ticks up when we see women's representation both high in the House and in the Senate, right? It is really that there's a strong correlation here. And you might be asking, okay, what are these types of bills and who is sponsoring them? Like who is responsible for this legislation? This is from the same article. So the types of women's rights bills that have been passed and debated in Argentina had to do with things like violence against women, sexual harassment, reproductive health, and gender quotas, right? And overwhelmingly, these are, what this percentages shows you is the individuals who are sponsoring this legislation, so who put this bill forward, and they are overwhelmingly women who are sponsoring this legislation. Or sort of put another way, it would be hard to envision that the Argentine legislature, if it was still 90% men, would be actively debating 80 new bills on violence against women every year, right? This is something that is really attributable to the women who have entered this space. Okay, and now we're going to travel to South Asia, to India in particular. And India has produced literally like a mountain of research, and mostly by economists. So economists love the Indian case because they have gender quotas at the local level, so for local government. And what they have done since the 1990s is that they randomize certain districts, so only women can run in these districts. Only women are allowed to be local counselors or like lead these local meetings that look like this. This is an all-women one, but this is sort of what the general sort of village democracy looks like in this context. They're very active village meetings, and the leadership of this meeting has to be a woman, but only in a third of the districts, and it's random, right? So economists really like that because it means that we can actually get at the causal effect of what's the effect of having a woman leader in this role. And and sort of just to like, in case it's not obvious, the problem here methodologically, and I don't want to get into methods too much, but it's, is it possible that countries that adopt gender quotas are more likely to have pro-women policies anyway, right? So is this a correlation that doesn't necessarily lead to causation? And this randomization really helps us get at that. And in fact, there's the study that I'm going to talk about, Chadabade and Duflo, has become really a canonical text here, and this sort of work helped Esther Duflo win the Nobel Prize recently, a couple of years ago, in economics. And what this study found is, first they did a survey of villagers, and they found that men villagers, on average, preferred infrastructure or investments in roads more than women did, because men travel further, they're more likely to work in these construction jobs. Like roads were a male-preferred good. There's a gender gap that favored men. And women were more likely to, if they're answering questions, what do you prioritize, to prioritize access to potable drinking water. And this is because women in Indian rural life and in most of the global south are the ones who are tasked with fetching this water. So they will spend often hours a day going down to the local river or well to access drinking water. So an investment in drinking water really helps their division of labor, right? And you also might think maybe they're also more concerned about issues related to public health. Having bad water is one of the leading causes of under 5 child deaths, for instance. All right, and what they found, these economists, were that in districts reserved for female leaders, counselors installed 9.2 more water pumps per districts than the districts that were not reserved, and in which men overwhelmingly won. So just another connection between having a woman in a leadership role and investing in goods that we know that women tend to prefer. All right, last study, and again, it's like I always try to find like where's the balance between really trying to convince you that this is a real relationship and not wanting to like, belabor the point. But this is a study that I did a few years ago with a co-author, and we were motivated because we thought, okay, like we have all of these studies from around the world, like the ones that I just told you, but they're usually just like one case, like in Argentina and India, here or there. We thought, is there a way that we could like globally try to assess around the world what's the impact of gender quotas? And so we had to think like, what's something that we can measure across countries that women legislators might have an impact on, and that we can collect data on relatively easily across as many countries as we can for as many years as we can. And we thought, okay, passing the national budget, this is something that all legislatures have to do. The World Bank collects really good data on this, on like what percentage of the national budget goes to defense spending, education spending, military, public health spending, et cetera. So these data come from the World Bank. What I'm showing you here is the graph that I just showed you earlier. This just shows you for countries that have adopted quotas, centered on quota adoption, right, we see this big jump in women's representation. What I'm going to show you now is a similar graphic, but instead of it being the percentage of women here, it's going to be health expenditures as a percentage of GDP. And so we see that there's sort of like a little bit of an increase like before countries adopt quotas, but after these countries adopt quotas, the slope of this line changes, right? So there's more attention to public health, right? So public health is a larger percentage of the budget after countries have adopted quotas. And to sort of dig into this further, we also know that there's a lot of variation in when countries adopt quotas. Sometimes they increase by 10%, 10 percentage points. Sometimes there's like no increase for weird reasons, but sometimes it's like 20 percentage points or more, right? So there's a lot of variation. So what we did next is we included only the cases that had above the average, what we call quota shock. So a more than 10 percentage point increase in women's parliamentary representation following the quota. And for these cases, where the quotas really did transform their legislatures, this is where we see the biggest difference, right? So we see sort of a pretty flat line before the country adopted quotas, then post-quota adoption, right, a really big increase in the percentage of the budget that's spent on health funding. And so I could just sort of go back full circle to the Uganda anecdote that I told you. We don't know if this is particularly about maternal health, child health, for instance, right? But we also have these stories from the field of where women parliamentarians are really rallying around this issue in particular of public health. Oh, and we also found that actually there's a decrease in military spending too in these cases, interestingly. All right, so let me sum up. So most countries use gender quotas to elect their legislatures around the world now. This is like very, very common part of representative democracy around the world. And this has led to a dramatic increase in women's political representation. And this increase in women's political representation has led to more legislative attention to issues that women tend to care more about than men, right? Where we see these really consistent gender gaps when we survey individuals. And I would argue that having men and women equally represented and their interests and their priorities equally represented in the national legislature helps to fulfill the promise of democracy. So I will end there. Thank you.
We've got a little bit of time for some questions. If you want to just you can stand in your own where you're sitting and tell us your name and what you're studying if you're a student, and we'll take the remaining 10 minutes or so to answer questions.
And my voice seems to have improved as I've been talking, so that's good. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Lily Wickham. I'm a cellular biology major with a women's studies minor.
Cool.
I just was wondering why you think that the U.S. has been slow to implement these gender quotas, and what would be like the best method for us to go about doing that?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, the U.S. really is an outlier, and in true American fashion, I don't think we know that we're an outlier, right? And you know, I do think that implementing gender quotas in the type of electoral system that we have is really difficult. So I think it's really easy when a country or when it has the type of electoral system where there's many people who represent a particular district. So if 10 people are representing a district, it seems easy to say, yes, half of those people have to be women. Parties can organize that on the front end by putting that number of candidates forward, right? So that's intuitive. I think it's really much more difficult in the system that we have. So that's a little bit of maybe a pass to the US. They're saying like it's not an easy problem here. There is an example. So the UK has the same type of electoral system that we do. In fact, obviously we got it from them. And there, the Labour Party, so sort of the main sort of center-left party, does have a gender quota, a voluntary gender quota. And how they have made it work is that they have said that we are going to make sure that we support as much as we can and like put forward women candidates in half of the districts that we think that Labour is going to win, that we think our political party is going to win. We're going to make sure that there are women running in half of those districts. Again, though, this is where the U.S. it's like a little bit difficult because there that means that the party has some control over who runs in which districts. And in the U.S. we are so decentralized in our candidate selection that it also makes it very, very hard to think about how to do that. So what does that leave us with? It does mean that like maybe we could think about trying to change some electoral systems at the local level such that we have multi-member districts, right? So that it's not just one person that you're electing, rather it's multiple people. You could think of maybe like at-large city council elections doing something like this, for instance. But otherwise, I think it's really about just trying to invest in and supporting, and the DNC and the RNC do have considerable power in terms of who they are supporting in particular races. So you can imagine a political party saying, we're going to make sure that we are supporting women as fully as we can in half of the districts in which we think that we're likely to win. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Jane. I'm a political science major, and I was just wondering, do you think that gender quotas are something that are more of a temporary solution to kind of take us to the point where women won't need that separation, or do you think it's something that should stay for forever, and then along with that, if there should be other gender inclusion as well?
What do you mean by the last point?
Like for LGBTQ+, transgender, non-binary, stuff like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the discourse in the early years of quota adoption was that it would be like a short-term special measure. But then what we've really seen is that hasn't been the case. Like when countries adopt quotas, they very rarely go back on them. And if they have, it's because there's been like severe regime change, like the case of Afghanistan, for instance, right? So it's not because like women have been able to achieve something, you know. And again, I think it's where electoral system really plays a role, because in countries that have these lists, like why wouldn't you always have a gender balance list? You know, like there's no reason not to, and forever, you know. I think it's more difficult in thinking about the sorts of electoral systems that we have. But the solution that I just talked about in terms of trying to make sure that you support women in like half of the candidacies, that means that you're supporting men in the other half, right? So it's like you're just being intentional in who you're supporting in order to make sure that there's equality. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with having equality always be in the mind of, you know, whoever's trying to design institutions or making decisions about who gets to power. In your second question, thinking about like non-binary individuals, you know, I think that this is the discourse around gender quotas really grew before we were having these discussions, and I think that people might criticize gender quotas for reinforcing a gender binary in a particular way, right? And I think that that's a valid point. You know, often quota, the language is that like no one sex or gender can be more than either like 60% of seats or 50% of seats. So you could imagine, I don't know though, I really have to think about that, like how you might like want to like integrate having like, I don't know, to have a quota for non-binary individuals, or to think about like, I don't know. It's a really, really interesting question. I want to like wrap my head around more. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Luz del Alba Rodriguez. I am a psychology major and a minor in global women's studies. I'm wondering about thinking about reproductive rights in the U.S. Do you think this is kind of a result of the lack of progression that we've had when it comes to gender quotas, specifically in the recent years here in the U.S.?
Yeah. So let me start by actually not talking about the U.S., but I'll talk about Mexico as a case where I think we do see a correlation between Mexico over the same time period that they have seen these really dramatic increases in women's political representation at all levels of government. And also even, for instance, in Mexico now, there's a gender quota for police, like a certain percentage of the police have to be, like it's really become like an all-encompassing idea. Anyway, that's an aside. But to say this sort of feminization of thinking about what political representation has looked like has also corresponded with the liberalization of reproductive rights. Right? So, you know, and remember that I showed you that graph about Argentina, where we also saw that it was women in these places that were putting forward bills around reproductive rights, reproductive justice. So I do think that there's a correlation there. I think that also just anecdotally looking at the US, like women in our Congress, they are often the ones that are more vocal on these issues too. And in fact, I have a colleague who worked on a paper and with co-authors, and they were interested, they measured how intense someone is in their speech by like measuring variation in vocal pitch. So if you like speak about something intensely, the pitch of your voice does something that I don't really understand. But they found that like women were more likely to speak intensely on issues related to women's rights than men were. Which makes sense. But also when you think about this connection, makes you think that like you want to have women in these spaces, actually regardless of what their position is on the issue, being the ones that are debating this because it's about their bodies, it's about their experiences that they have probably had or will have. So maybe I'll just say that is that I think it is fundamentally unfair to not have women in the room when you're discussing these issues. Thank you all.